Hey Living Environment, it's Miss Padover, and I want to welcome you to day one of quarter 4. During this quarter, we're going to be focusing on the human impact on our environment with a specific focus on how we as individuals can play a role in making the world a better place. So we're going to start by reading the short passage that you have on your Google Doc. I'm going to scroll down and I will read and you can follow. With dozens more countries enforcing lockdowns in response to the pandemic, a wide range of indicators show how transport use, electricity demand, and industrial activity are being cut. Many experts have warned that carbon emissions usage will quickly rebound unless the response to the pandemic can create lasting structural changes towards net zero emissions. Here, Carbon Brief gathers the latest evidence on how the coronavirus crisis is affecting energy use and CO2 emissions around the world, as a way to sense check the expert estimates. 5 key data sets and projections are identified, covering roughly 3/4 of the world's annual CO2 emissions, including the entire output of China and the US, the EU carbon market, the Indian power sector, and the global oil sector. After reading this, I want you to answer this question. While we may be reducing our carbon usage now, what are the experts warning us about long-term consequences? You can pause this video now and take a look back into the passage to answer that question. Now that you've answered this question, we're going to move on to the next section where you will be looking at a graph and answering some questions to help you interpret what the graph is showing you. So when I first look at this graph, I'm going to make sure that I look at what is the title. So the coronavirus could trigger the largest ever annual fall in CO2 emissions. And then I remind myself, what are CO2 emissions? And I think back to earlier in Living Environment, where we learned that CO2 emissions are the gases released during combustion or the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, natural gas to produce electricity. And this leads to global warming. So looking at this graph, I want to understand what is happening right now during this coronavirus pandemic and how is it impacting the amount of CO2 that is being released into our environment. So I'm taking a look at the questions below, and it's first asking me to look at this data set. According to the data set, we stopped using roughly 500 tons of CO2 during the energy crisis. So we see the energy crisis is happening right here. So let's go back. What is one of the events which had about a 750 ton loss? So I'm looking on my x-axis and I want to see that 750 ton loss. I know it's going to be somewhere between that -500 and that -1000. So based on that, I'm going to find my answer. What are those 2 events that could have resulted in 750 ton loss of CO2? And that would be my answer to the first question. Then for the second question, what is the estimated amount of CO2 we are saving during the coronavirus pandemic? Then I'm going to look back up to the top of my chart, and I know that the gray is what we're talking about. That the red is what we're talking about for right now, estimated impacts. So I want to see specifically for the US, where is that? And I'm going to follow where the US is listed down to see what is listed at its x-axis. So the US is here. I'm going to follow all the way down and see where is it listed at its x-axis? Somewhere around here. So you guys have to find that. And then for the last question, why is our CO2 emissions, or the amount we use, decreasing? So this, we have to look back to our earlier reading to think about what are reasons that the emissions are decreasing. What are things that maybe we're doing, things that are not running the way they used to be? Why is that happening, that our CO2 emissions are decreasing? After you've done that, and you can put a pause on this to complete those questions, Then we're going to move on to our final conclusion question. So going forward, what are some things that we can learn from this pandemic that could realistically be brought into our daily lives after social distancing has been lifted? So when I'm answering this question, I'm thinking about, well, what are things that I do on a daily basis that impact the amount of CO2 that gets released into our environment? And I think about how I get places. So do I take a train? Do I take a car? Do I use a bike? How could one of those choices be better for our environment than another? And how might you be able to make a different choice that would be better for our environment? I also want to think about where I go shopping. Based on where I'm getting my fruits and vegetables and my meat could be helpful in the release of carbon emissions and making our world a safer place. And then I'm also going to be thinking about how am I living my life in terms of, am I recycling? Am I using reusable bags? Things along those lines. So I want you to do your best to answer that question and be realistic about ways that you can make a difference for our environment. We'll be here if you need us at 2:15 today, and we wish you good luck with this assignment, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. Have a great day. Bye.